One fundamental distinction in ethics is that between something that has moral worth or moral status or counts as a moral patient on the one hand, and something like a mere object or a thing on the other. So if a thing has moral worth, then probably it has interests. You have certain obligations not to treat it in certain ways, to harm it, for instance. And if it doesn't, if it's just a sort of a mere thing, like, I don't know, a rock or a pen or a mug or something, it doesn't have any interests or not any moral interests. It has no moral status. We don't have any moral obligations to the thing, so on and so forth. Okay, so you get the basic distinction. There's a big question about whether and under what conditions AI could have a moral status. Now, usually this debate gets played out in the context of the kind of AI that we use every day, like large language models, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever. My guest today, though, wants to focus on something else. He wants to focus on what he calls, or what is called, a xenobot. This is an AI-created microscopic organism that engages in certain kind of goal-directed behavior. And my guest thinks it is plausibly of moral worth. My guest today, by the way, Josh Gellers, PhD. He is now the Dean of Professional and Lifelong Learning and inaugural Faculty Fellow for Artificial Intelligence at the University of North Florida. He was previously a professor of political science there as well. And you're going to hear us talk about lots of stuff in this context, and you'll hear a bunch of pushback. Some of it is I'm on the same side as Josh, pushing against the people that he's arguing against. Sometimes I'm arguing against Josh. There's a few things that I want to highlight here, a few sort of debates that bear mentioning now so you can track them during our conversation. One thing to keep track of is there's a case in which AI can create an entity that has moral worth. And then I ask, does that mean the AI itself has moral worth? Couldn't it be the case that the AI is a tool without moral worth that can nonetheless play some crucial role in creating something else of moral worth? That's one of the big focuses of our conversations. Another one has to do with whether something needs to be natural in order to have moral worth. A lot of the people that Josh is interacting with seem to think that a necessary condition, maybe even a sufficient condition for being valuable, having moral worth, is that it somehow be of nature, or in another view, be connected to nature. And I push back on that view as well. And then finally, another thing to track is the extent to which moral status or moral worth comes in degrees. So for instance, you might think that some things, let's say ants, have some degree of moral worth, but you might think it's obvious that they have less moral worth than humans, and so much better to sacrifice some ants than human beings, or something along those lines. So one thing I want to keep track of is, even if you think that AI has some degree of moral worth, it's a further question as to what the degree of moral worth it has, such that what does it call for sacrificing? What other kinds of priorities are we supposed to sacrifice? And I'm a little bit dubious, more than a little bit dubious, that even if AI has moral worth, which I deny, that it has sufficient moral worth such that we should start, say, sacrificing human life in favor of it. Josh pushes back on all of this, of course, and he emphasizes that he thinks that we should take on views that are non-Western in nature that would ascribe moral worth to AI and other kinds of what you might call technological creatures or something along those lines. And then I push back on that a little as well. Just like we don't expect them to adopt our views, we don't necessarily need to adopt their views, and that's still on the ethical up and up. Anyway, you'll hear us talk about all this stuff and more in our conversation. Okay, that's what this episode is about. A reminder, on April 21st, my new book, The Ethical Nightmare Challenge, is available for purchase on Amazon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want an advanced copy of that book, all you have to do is sign up to be on my book launch campaign. So you'll help out very minorly. It'll take you maybe 5 minutes to do things like write a review on Amazon, maybe post to link to social media once. And in exchange for that, I will send you an advanced digital copy of my book. So if you're interested in that, or you have any other comments, criticisms about my podcast, suggestions, you can email me at em@reedblackman.com. Okay, that's enough about me and my book. Let's go talk to Josh. So Josh, when I talk to guests and we're prepping, I like to say, so tell me what your big thing is so that I can say something like, hey, you think that X, but surely X is crazy. So tell me, do I actually have you right? Do you think that X? But then I, of course, caveat that with, of course, it doesn't have to be a crazy view, just what's the big thing. But you happily provided what is clearly a crazy view. AI, as it exists now, already has moral status. Yes. So tell me, Josh, is that what you think? Because I would have thought not X. I would have thought that it's not the case that AI has moral status. So why do you think such a thing?
That's a great question. I think for me, I'll bracket this by saying I'm focused on very specific types of what technology might fall under artificial intelligence.
Okay.
That does not include the entire suite of everything that falls under that umbrella of AI. Most people are probably thinking in terms of LLMs or large language models or I don't know, everything to delivery robots and all that stuff. What I tried to do in this paper that I recently published with my co-author Magdalena Holy-Lukaj was to take what we would in social science call the most likely case. So this is where you have all these variables, and if they align, then it's something that would be almost inarguable that it fits the parameters of whatever you're trying to prove. So in this case, our most likely case is this little tiny creature called the Xenobot. And we use this as both a real world case, but also a kind of avenue for exploring the potential for moral status of specific kinds of AI. And in particular, what we do is we use both environmental ethics and philosophy of technology and say, look, if no matter which of these approaches we take, and even if we take a very hardline, strict, biocentric, environmental ethical perspective, even this kind of quasi-biomachine type entity would qualify as having moral status.
Okay, but so let's back up though. I get that you're not talking about LLMs, correct?
Absolutely not.
So that's the sort of thing that jumps out as it making it sound like in my view, a crazy view, that LLMs have moral status. So what's a Xenobot?
A Xenobot is this little kind of molecular creature that is basically created using artificial intelligence and multiple model runs to determine the optimum sort of format, size, and shape of this little being that is created using frog cells. And it's developed in a laboratory, basically grown in a petri dish, but it's programmed and then it's birthed into the world and can act autonomously. And so what's really interesting about this is it's something that was not created through a normal biological process. It's something that is an artifact of human ingenuity. And yet, once we develop it, it then takes on literally a life of its own, and it features several of the properties that even environmental ethicists would have to agree satisfy their status.
Before we get into the whole moral status stuff, I still want to know what the hell a Xenobot is. Are we talking about literally a collection of cells?
Yes,
I mean, it's not
tiny little thing.
It's microscopic.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a living organism that you can see under a microscope, and it came to existence, as it were, from human intervention using AI tools in particular. So one question, is this distinct from, it is distinct, but it just sounds to me like a variety of CRISPR, right? So we use CRISPR to do genetic engineering, to cut up DNA and slice things together, splice things together. Is it like that, but instead of using CRISPR as a technique to mess with genes, you're using AI somehow?
I think it's a good analogy. I think the difference here is that it results in this actual entity that then can go and do things on its own. And so it's not just about how we manipulate the genes of an entity, it's about creating an entirely new kind of entity altogether.
Can you say about what you mean when you say it can do things on its own? In some sense, I suppose amoebas do things on their own, or they exhibit behavior on their own, whatever that means. They causally interact with the world around them. They don't think, they don't deliberate, of course. So when you say they do things on their own, are you using that phrase to be capacious enough so that it would apply to single-cell organisms?
So when I say that it can do things on its own or act autonomously, I mean it can do certain things like replicate itself, engage in goal-directed behavior, which are hallmarks of what we think of as intelligent beings or beings that are worth something morally.
We do? I mean, I would take it that a weed would qualify there, right? Weeds self-replicate, and they have quasi-goal-directed behavior in that they suck up water and they go towards the sunlight to make sure they survive. Evolutionary speaking, there's an explanation for all that, blah, blah, blah. So weeds would count as meeting those criteria.
Well, so...
And I wouldn't call them autonomous. I wouldn't say weeds act autonomously or something along those lines.
I think that, so your classical biocentric, life-centered environmental ethicist would say it doesn't have any kind of, it's not considered alive in the sense that...
A plant?
Let me back up. There's a distinction even in environmental ethics between living and non-living creatures. And living creatures are typically those that are made of flesh and blood and have a circulatory system and a brain and all that kind of stuff. And non-living include things like weeds, rocks, mountains, lakes, rivers, and all that stuff. So a bioethicist would say, or biocentric environmental ethicist would say, no, that is not the kind of life we're talking about because it's not actually alive.
Or that's an insane, that's obviously an insane view.
Or not alive. Not alive in the way that, say, a domesticated animal is.
But it's odd that you would put plants in the same category as rocks.
Again, so there is more interest now in fact, plant sentience as being a kind of concept.
Forget about sentience. It's a living organism, no? A plant?
But without the same capacities as putatively living creatures are.
Okay. I'm still not sure. Maybe this doesn't matter. Tell me if this doesn't matter to the argument. Tell me it doesn't matter.
No, I think it's good to. This is more than anyone else has teased this out, so I appreciate it. Yeah.
So look, there's lots of what I would characterize as living organisms: plants, trees, I don't know, flowers, bushes, the whole whatever, that whole horticultural kingdom. I don't know what the appropriate thing is. There are phenomenally single cell organisms like amoebas. There's more complex. If you characterize goldfish as really stupid, maybe they're actually smarter than we think, but whatever, there are living organisms clearly. But there's lots of different things in the biological world that exhibit activities like self-replication or reproduction in some way or other, and that exhibit what you might call goal-directed behavior, even though they're not doing it with a mind, right? So plants bend towards the sun because they need the sunlight for to engage in mitochondria activity, blah, blah, blah. I don't really know. This is where my expertise of biology is non-existent. Anyway, so they seem to satisfy those criteria, and I wouldn't say I'd say they do things on their own. I don't know what that I'd use as lofty a word as autonomy to describe their behaviors.
So I think we actually agree here, and the difference is that a xenobot is an artifact or something that is created by humans. It doesn't exist naturally. So that's where the rub is in terms of what distinguishes this between even plants like you just brought up. Environmental ethicists would take little issue with, or at least some of them, thinking of a plant as a kind of being or entity that has some degree of moral worth, especially ecocentric environmental ethicists.
Well, I don't even know that it has sorry. I was just going to say, I don't even know that. I haven't said anything about moral worth or moral status, and we also have to say what we mean by that. But I'm just saying that they're living. Whatever their moral status is, TBD. But I think it's pretty obvious that they're living and they engage in quasi goal-directed behavior. And what you would say pre-Darwin is something about their intelligence, maybe, or something, the divine intelligence, blah, blah. But post-Darwin, we say, no, it looks like they're engaged in goal-directed behavior, but actually there's a story here, natural selection, blah, blah, blah. If they didn't engage in that kind of behavior, they wouldn't have been selected for, but they did, so they reproduced, yada, yada. And so we have if you like, naturalistic explanation for why things exhibit what appears to be goal-directed behavior, or it is goal-directed behavior, even though there's no intelligence or there's no mind, there's no intentions there.
And yet, the environmental ethicists would say, that's right, and that's why it's morally considerable. But they would say the same thing about anything that is an artifact. They would say it is not morally considerable at all.
Okay, so let's say a little bit about this morally considerable, moral status, moral worth. What do you mean when you talk about this?
I think it hews most closely to thinking about something in terms of being a moral patient. So is this something that could be made worse off by some kind of actions taken upon it? Could its interests be harmed in some cognizable way?
Okay. Can its interests be harmed? Okay. Or undermined? Okay. Suppose that can't be enough. So one, we're going to get into debates about whether trees have interests. I don't know whether they have interests. Interests to me sounds desire-y. Like your interests are something like your set of desires. But even putting that to the side, I can think this thing has interests, but I have no moral reason to pay those interests any regard. So let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that weeds have interests because they exhibit goal-directed behavior and self-replicate, blah, blah, blah. Let's suppose I say, okay, fine, it's got interests, but why should I care about that? Why should I have any moral reason to care about that? It's not a moral patient, to use your term. I know that it's not just your term. Lots of people use the term moral patient. But yeah, so I don't think we get anywhere. There's not a simple hop over from has interests to has moral status, or a sufficient moral status such that we ought to pay attention to those interests.
So for environmental ethicists, it is, and that's exactly what it does, that you could not ignore because of your ethics that if something satisfies the rubric that you've come up with to determine moral status, you have an obligation to treat it with more consideration than those that do not warrant that status.
Maybe, okay, it can't be, they can't, we could say this is what a lot of environmental ethicists think. It doesn't settle the debate, though, whether it's okay.
I'm definitely not settling it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to go within their own framework.
Right.
What would be something that you could justify, and yet it would potentially be against what they have written as necessary for enjoying moral status.
Okay. And then, all right. So let's grant, for the sake of argument, that if a thing, is this right? If a thing is living, and we define living as is goal-directed behavior and self-replicates, reproduces, something like that, then thereby, I take it, that entails it has interests. And if it has interests, that entails on this view that it deserves our sort of moral consideration, that we should, something along those lines. Okay. I find that all highly contentious, but let's put that to the side for a minute so we can talk about the Xenobot. Okay. Does AI, one question here is, why does the AI part of the story matter? It could be AI, it could be CRISPR. God himself suddenly creates a Xenobot. We never had it there, and he's, yep, let's do a Xenobot. Poof, there's a Xenobot. I take it that once you've got a Xenobot, however you got there, two things. One, on this view, it will just have a moral status. The fact that it's not natural, whatever that means, is neither here nor there. And the other thing to say is that it doesn't seem then that AI has any kind of moral status or moral worth. It just means that AI is a tool by which we can create things that have a moral status.
So two things here. One is, what makes this interesting is it's a kind of what some scholars call a hybrid. So it's not something that falls into a particular category quite easily and distinctly. And then more philosophically, it's an example of a type of being that traverses this Cartesian divide between nature and culture. So you're right that something could be born or something could be bestowed by God, but there would be a degree of naturalness to it. And what Xenobot or CRISPR, so I'm just using one example, it could have been written, anything that's artificially devised by AI, as opposed to consider the Xenobot, would be something that, again, would really cut against what people have said is the kind of entity that is at all eligible for moral status. So it helps us to explode these categories that we think of as very distinct, and the environmental ethicists in particular would never place in the category of moral worthiness.
Yeah, I guess I don't yet see. Maybe it explodes something about how environmental ethicists think about things. Well, it's so much the worse for them. But what about, let's take another case. Do environmental ethicists think that children who are the result of IVF don't have moral status?
No, they would say it's alive. That's it.
But I thought it was, the problem was that if there's some kind of like technological intervention that undoes, as it were, the naturalness of it. So I see what you're saying.
So this is a great question I would love to pose to an environmental ethicist for whom the sort of artifacticity of an entity is really a problem.
Yeah, so I think we should just say this environmental ethicist, I don't know how widespread this view is just totally confused and wrong.
Myself and Magdalena are folks who have written in that area, and then invite in the technological thing precisely to push them on these questions that they have taken, we argue, for granted. Maybe we're calling it the environmental ethicist, but I take it there's lots of environmental ethicists with lots of different views, right? You get two philosophers in the room, you're going to have 5 opinions. So is it a certain view according to which all value or all moral status is grounded in being a living thing? They're looking around. There's some people, environmental ethicists or not, they're looking around for the source of value. What is it that makes it the case that things have value? And so they look around and they conclude, for whatever reason, it's that the thing is alive. And that's our sort of foundational moral view. That is for one camp. There's basically 2 camps who write on this issue.
Yeah.
One camp are the biocentrists, who say it's got to be an individual entity that is alive. And that's pretty much explaining their entire point.
That's a necessary condition or a sufficient condition?
Necessary.
Not sufficient.
Necessary. I think necessary and sufficient.
Okay.
So then you have the ecocentrists, who say, what is the larger role that this plays within, say, an ecosystem?
Right.
And it's the role that it plays that is also morally significant and therefore worthy of some kind of status.
So if you have a river that is not itself alive, but it supports an ecosystem of things that stands in the right causal relation to the flourishing.
And the biocentrists would say the river isn't alive, doesn't count.
Okay.
So that's the big fissure among environmental ethicists on this question of ontology or being.
And so if you think that, I still don't see why, though, if the issue is, so for the What is it? What was the first category?
They're biocentrists. So they're specifically focused on individual beings that are alive.
So for the biocentrists, they should just save the xenobot. Yeah, that thing is a living thing.
But they don't. They can't. They don't accept it.
Why not? They don't say anything about how the thing comes to be alive, right? They just say it's alive. And once it's alive, it's got a certain sort of moral status. And
they would take issue with its genesis in the first instance.
Why?
So they would say, you'd have to ask them. We try to recapture some of the literature, but basically they start from the presumption that there is this kind of naturalness to how things are created.
Yeah.
And it imbues it with a sort of, in the case of humans, dignity, in the case of the natural world, things that we should care about and care about preserving.
Okay, so here's an obvious counterexample. There's a tremendous storm. Maybe it's not such an obvious counterexample. To philosophers, it should be an obvious counterexample. There's a storm of some kind. This is like a swamp man thing. The lightning hits a swamp. A creature comes out, fully sentient, fully intelligent, full emotional profile, blah, blah, blah. If you prick him, he bleeds, et cetera, et cetera. Seems like a pretty good candidate for a being with moral worth. It's a weird genesis. But there you go. Or you get some alien scientists who have some crazy molecular reorganizer and they create another human being, let's say, or another alien for that matter, by running some molecules through a machine and it reorganizes the puzzle, as it were, and they shape it into a human being. Why would we think the genesis is a sort of whatever a natural genesis is? Why should the biocentrists think it's a necessary condition? It just seems totally arbitrary.
A good question. It's a good question, but I think you're touching on part of the problem that I think these sort of hybrids or assemblages, to use a Latourian term, really encounter. So I don't know if there is a very strong reason why these examples that you've given could not fit the parameters of what a biocentric environmental ethicist would argue is necessary or sufficient. But I would say that in those two specific examples you gave, the sort of naturally occurring through this disaster or event would maybe have more license to be given that status because it seemingly emerged from a process that humans didn't directly intervene in. So it's almost like the Frankensteinian of problem here, right? But I think that once you introduce an intervention where a human purposively creates something, not through a biological cycle or something like that, for them, it's, in a way, it serves as a detriment to what almost appears to be a kind of religious dogma about the importance of life and maybe the existence of a soul or something like that.
It's definitional that humans intervene in human reproduction because they literally are reproducing themselves. So the view can't be humans can't have a role in the production of the living being because that would rule out all human beings as having moral worth.
I think the difference would be that our equipment is not something that we've manufactured synthetically, right?
Some of it is test tubes and IVF and what about, I don't know, figuring out when someone is ovulating and so planning sex around that. Is that natural? Is that from the fruits of our labors that we figure some stuff out?
To me, these are tremendously good objections that I think the philosophers of technology would seize upon, and the environmental ethicists would still find some kind of way to weasel their way out of it. So I completely agree that these are all good objections that you're raising.
Yeah. And the other one, what was the second one? The sort of
ecocentric?
Yeah, ecocentric. Yeah. For them, it just seems like everything's got value. The only things that don't have value is the ones that play literally no causal role in, let's say, the flourishing of living things.
Yeah, I'll give you a very concrete example that's not a xenobot, but I think because what we try to do is prove that either under this individual perspective or this holistic perspective, the rules lead us to the same conclusion, which is that this kind of an entity is worthy of moral status. If you have a robot that's out in nature and its function is to clean up waterways, it's performing a kind of ecosystem service and therefore contributes to the whole. And so if someone were to destroy that, it's actually going to harm the whole ecosystem. Yeah. So that's where an ecocentric theorist would say, in that context, that robot is playing a role and therefore it enjoys a kind of moral status. Not in this office, but in another office, if I've got a robot that's sitting on a shelf doing nothing, there's no way in which that's playing a role in a larger ecosystem.
So I know you know this distinction, but I'll just say it for the audience. There's a basic distinction in ethics between, there's different ways of carving this up or naming it, but there's intrinsic value and there's instrumental value. Mm-hmm. So if something's of intrinsic value, it's good for its own sake. It's not just good for some further good. You might think that the way that you regard a loved one is not as an instrument, it's not a means to an end. They're an end in themselves. They're deserving of respect and love and care and admiration or whatever, protection, defense, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. And then instrumental value is just the stuff that isn't valuable itself, but it gets us the valuable things. So the most obvious example here is literally instruments, like tools, screwdrivers, or whatever, are good for building houses, and then houses are good because they keep us alive and we can do the things that we want to do, and that's the stuff that's intrinsically valuable. So there's just a basic distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value, and it just seems, that seems like a fairly obvious distinction, that some things are going to be instrumentally valuable without being intrinsically valuable, and it sounds like the ecocentrist is just running roughshod over that very basic distinction.
So I don't want to hit them too hard. I think we are making an argument. We're making an argument that they themselves don't make, but we're showing how their logic applies and supports our conclusion. And I think that they would agree that there is this difference, and that is a huge debate within environmental ethics in general. Yeah. But that's why we're trying to find these like edge cases which illuminate these sorts of differences and get people to ask the same kind of questions that you're asking and to really probe at the fundamental level, what are we talking about here? Yeah. And if we zoom out forget environmental ethics for a second, there's a lot of people who still think on the animal rights side of things that they take a Kantian approach and say the reason why we shouldn't hurt animals is because it makes us worse off as humans and more likely to harm each other. That is still a perspective that lots of animal ethicists share, even if it's not maybe the dominant perspective. So even if you go outside of that group of ethicists and you go into animals or others, there are some people who will say, they call it indirect as opposed to maybe instrumental, but that there are indirect reasons why we should give something moral status as well.
Well, we don't give it moral status. I would say we give it moral status. We recognize its moral status as being such that we ought to refrain from engaging in certain kinds of harmful activities. That's whatever. That's one thing to say. So I don't know that we don't give out moral status. We discover that things have a certain moral status, and we figure out that we haven't been treating them in a way that's commensurate with the moral status that they have, as opposed to like legal rights. Legal rights we give out, and we
totally positive law and all that.
And to your earlier point, Kant himself said animals don't have moral worth. He just said straight out they don't have moral worth, but we shouldn't treat them like shit because that causally leads us to having a bad character where we're going to treat people like shit, and so it's morally verboten, not because kicking cat is bad, intrinsically bad or wrong. It's just that it might lead us to do bad things or wrong things, whatever.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Let's go back to the AI part of this, because the sort of a jarring part of your claim, really. I mean, that these people are wrong, the biocentrists and the ecocentrists are wrong. This just strikes me as totally obvious for a variety of reasons. But your claim is something like AI already has moral status, that strikes me as I'm not sure why you think that yet, and here's why. You've told a story about the Xenobot, true story about the Xenobot, where AI is used in order to create a thing that has certain kinds of characteristics, blah, blah, that's living and blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. Then let's say it has interests, and let's say if it has interests, it has a moral status such that we should refrain from harming it. Okay, all contentious, but I'll grant it. Still, I wouldn't think that would lead me to conclude that AI has any kind of moral status. It would say that the Xenobot has a certain moral status. Oh, how did you get to that? Through AI. So the AI, to bring up the distinction that we just talked about, AI in the Xenobot case looks like it has, at best, instrumental value, but no intrinsic value, because you haven't created, if you like, an AI being, that is, say, a being that's sort of, if you like, constituted by AI in the way that an LLM is, although it's not a being. So why should I think that AI has any kind of moral status here, as opposed to just being another case of instrumental value?
So it's this weird boundary case where not only is AI used to create it, but then its fundamental encoding, what it does, the shapes that it takes, are a function of AI. It is not a kind of Darwinian process that selects different forms. It's because it was programmed in such a way that it takes certain shapes or morphology and then engages in certain kinds of behaviors, like a kind of novel replication that no other living creature is capable of. So what it is, it constitutes this kind of a hybrid bio-machine that does not exist in nature. And again, for many ethicists who would be looking at this, whether they're animal or environmental, their gut reaction is, of course it doesn't have any kind of moral status. It didn't come from anything. It was because humans in a lab created it, and AI was the one that programmed it. And so we're pushing on those assumptions, because it's something that doesn't cleanly fit into either the category of a biological entity or a pure machine.
The distinction between sort of artificial and natural strikes me as a total red herring. I don't see, if you have a view that to be all value has to come from nature, okay, fine. But I don't see any reason why we should think that the causal genesis of the thing is a crucial component of whether the thing has value. Maybe there's an argument, I'm sure there's an argument to the contrary, but I don't see that. But the thing is, your claim, though, was that it has some degree of moral status and it's somehow composed of AI. I don't think that DNA, just DNA lying around, maybe this is contentious if you think about embryos or something, I don't know. DNA just lying around, does DNA have moral status? I don't know.
Again, it depends on what sort of perspective you're adopting. If you are an environmental ethics person, it's the easy answer, no.
Okay, but even just intuitively, forget about your theory, and especially the bonkers theories, what sounds to me like a bonkers theory of the biocentric and the ecocentric people. They might be necessary conditions. Maybe this is something like, all right, look, let me put it differently. I don't get to be around. Let's suppose that I have a certain moral status, that humans have a certain moral status. We'll grant that for the sake of argument. That one is easy. And let's say that without oxygen, we're not around. If I don't have oxygen, I'm dead. So if I'm dead, I also have no moral status, right? I don't conclude from that oxygen is is intrinsically valuable. I just think it's instrumentally valuable. It's a necessary condition for me to be around, that there be oxygen around, something along those lines.
So this is very akin to the argument for marginal cases, where the moral status of something hinges on a property that's supposed to be associated with and necessary for moral status. And then you have someone who is on life support, unable to breathe by themselves. They're being kept alive because of a machine.
Yeah.
As soon as you take that off, they're no longer alive. The doctor comes in and tells you this person cannot feel, cannot witness, cannot speak, cannot respond, all that stuff. So let me tell you where this actually leads. I had an animal rights ethicist, or rather an animal rights scholar, tell me that because of this case, this particular kind of situation, you could cut the limbs off of that person and it wouldn't be morally reprehensible, because since they're no longer sentient, they no longer have any kind of moral status at all. And yet the human rights theorists, that's really where my background comes from, is jarred because of that, because they say, no, the human still has dignity irrespective of whether they can currently feel. But it gets you into all kinds of thorny questions about this, what we call like a unicriterial approach to moral status, which relies on one thing, and whether you have that or not determines whether we should treat you well or not.
There's lots to say in response to that animal rights person, like we'd want to respect their wishes. It would be disrespectful to the person if they said, hey, listen, even when I'm not sentient, don't cut my limbs off. So you might think it'd be an act of disrespect, even though the person is dead. You might think it'd be disrespectful to people who care about that person. There's all sorts of moral reasons to not start slicing and dicing. But again, your claim is that the AI is possessed of moral worth, moral status, is a moral patient. But I still don't see how you get to that claim, because that conclusion, because it just seems like a necessary condition. It's like the oxygen in the air, or it's like DNA, that disembodied DNA or something, whatever that means. I get that it's an instruction book or it tells the thing how to move. But if I think that what grounds the moral status of the thing is something like being living or being sentient or whatever I think it is, or any multitude of things, at no point do I think, AI is in the mix there as one of the things that grants status.
Let me make one very important clarification.
Yeah.
So that is, there is AI that is providing the kind of the infrastructure for how this thing is going to look and behave and all that.
Yeah.
Once it is created, it is considered under the umbrella of artificial intelligence, under the robotics, it's considered soft robotics. So it's not because there's a program that somewhere gets fed into a machine and then it runs a bunch of model iterations. It's because the product itself of that process is considered a robot.
Okay, but then if you ask me, why does this robot have a certain moral status, a moral worth, I would say, first of all, I'd probably say it doesn't. But if I did say that it does, I'd probably point to things like it's sentient. Or maybe it's the robot's sentience that makes it valuable, not the fact that its legs are made of chrome or whatever. That's not relevant to its moral status. Or maybe I think the robot has a certain moral status or is a moral patient because it exhibits goal-directed behavior, and that's sufficient in my view. Again, it's not because the thing has an NVIDIA processor. So
Right.
At no point, I'm still going to refer to, or I'm going to appeal to more or less sort of standard criteria for what constitutes conditions or what makes it the case that something has moral worth. At no point am I pointing to the kind of metal that it uses, the kind of computer chip that it uses, the kind of programming that it's running, AI or otherwise. So I still don't think we get to AI is intrinsically valuable.
That would make you very different from the people that I'm directly interfacing with.
Great, because those people sound like they've got bonkers views.
And then I could do a whole other podcast just on sentience alone, but people like David Gunkel have written literally volumes on why that is an insufficient approach, which is called the properties-based approach to moral status. He has a chapter that he lays out all these different reasons as to why we can't rely on a sole factor to try and make that determination. So even if you want to refer to sentience or consciousness or rationality, if every philosopher in the world got together and said, we agree, it's sentience, you would still have problems that would happen with certain edge cases, or like what the argument for marginal cases talks about.
Sure. Okay, so we can talk about sentience in a bit, but let's go back for a second. Mm-hmm. Let's grant, for the sake of argument, that in some broad sense, we confer moral status upon this, whatever, AI-ish being, the Xenobot. Okay, now what? So what does that mean? So I guess my question is, does it just show that those theories are wrong, or is there a larger upshot about what that means about how we should proceed in the development of AI?
So there's two things here. One is that it actually does counsel, and we give a couple of recommendations in the paper about how you would actually treat it if indeed you agreed that it had moral status or it qualified for that. And things like not impeding its self-directed behavior. So you couldn't, and I'll just give you a really easy example. If it's existing in a petri dish, you couldn't say, okay, we've made it, and then throw it against a wall. That would be considered a kind of grave moral harm to this entity that we've now determined to have moral status. The other side of it, which we talked about before the podcast, is this question of ethics, which I think is what you were alluding to at the beginning, right? Why should we care? Why should we behave in certain ways towards certain things at all? What guides that behavior? And so part of what we're also doing in this paper is saying, let's look and examine your actual ethical imperatives. And if you want to live up to them, it means these things that I don't think you intended for it to mean. And yet, if you disagree now, and you think that this is some kind of weird outlier case, which might be the case, then you got to change somewhere your theory so that it does not accommodate these kinds of entities. So we're also doing a bit of theoretical innovation as well. We're asking for clarification if you think that there's a reason why these things should not pass muster.
So let me ask you this, though, about the moral status stuff. I could see the point about you don't want to, if you grant it moral status, then you can't just throw it out against a wall and destroy it. I take it, though, I would think a couple things. I would think that moral status comes in degrees. I'm not sure that I should see it as an on-off switch as opposed to a dimmer switch. Suppose that if I take a xenobot or a tree or a weed or any manner of things that, let's say, has some degree of moral status, I might say, yeah, look, we should just burn down trees for fun. There's something gross about that. What are you doing? I actually once was dating a girl, and we were in Florida, and there was like this beautiful shell. And then she said, oh, that's so pretty, whatever. And she stepped on it. And I was aghast. I was like, what the hell is wrong with you? What a psychopath. But it was a shell. Not sentient, but whatever. It was aesthetically valuable. And so I thought it was gross. I did not marry that person, incidentally. Okay. I get that. But if you want to build a home, all right, cut down some trees. If there's any manner of thing that you can do to this thing that has some degree of moral status or some degree of moral worth, whatever you want to call it, but it comes in degrees, and there's other things that can trump it. Mm-hmm. So I might agree with you. Yeah, okay, fine. Let's just say that I agree. The Xenobot has moral worth, moral status, it's a moral patient. Let's even go further and say the AI or the AI being has moral status. Again, I'm dubious for the reasons I articulated, but we'll grant it. I might say, but it's so tiny. It's such a tiny bit. In the way that when my then girlfriend stepped on the shell, I might be aghast. That was gross, but it wasn't a grave sin or whatever. And if someone said, hey, if we get rid of all these xenobots, we can really make a home for the elderly, I'd be like, all right, let's get rid of the xenobots then. What are we doing here? This is a no-brainer. So this is just a very long-winded way of saying moral status, it seems, comes in degrees. And this seems like a very low-level moral status of this thing, if at all.
So there is I forget who said it, but there is a famous quote that moral status admits of degrees. I'm not sure I strictly adhere to that, but I think many people have made the similar case that you're just articulating.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, and we actually don't talk a great deal about this in the paper. It's but one paper, we probably could develop it.
Yeah, of course,
more.
of course.
But this idea of what happens when you have interests that come into conflict. And that is an interesting kind of moral dilemma. And as you mentioned, there's a utilitarian way of going about that. There's maybe a deontological way of going about that. So you could take different lenses and try to come up with a solution about, like, on the one hand, you could say, like you gave the example of if you destroy all of them and you build a house for the elderly, the greater good created by that could actually be very beneficial when you look at costs and benefits. It could also be that that xenobot is the last thing, and if there's going to result in a chain of events that ultimately saves us from climate change. And so destroying that last xenobot is going to actually be to the detriment of everything. So that really, I would say, like, we're pretty agnostic on that. At least I don't want to speak for my co-author, but I think that there's a lot of room to have that kind of conversation. And I don't allege to have the answer for what you do and when those interests collide. But it is something that animal ethicists definitely deal with this a lot. And I'll give you one personal example, just to illustrate, because you mentioned the xenobot, you mentioned a shell. So thinking on that kind of scale, when I was doing my Fulbright in Sri Lanka, I was living in this mother-in-law suite, and at night there was a spider. And I took out the mop, or there was a broom, and it was cement like floors. Yeah. And I'm whacking, and the guy I'm renting from calls me on my cell phone. He said, "Everything okay? I'm hearing this horrible racket downstairs." And I said, "Yeah, like this crazy spider." And it was like a huge spider was coming around. And he saw it, and so he came downstairs, he saw it, and he puts it in his hand. He's a Buddhist. There are Buddhist books in the library. And there's a book on Buddhism and veganism. So this is the sort of ethical perspective he's coming from. And he takes the spider and he puts it in his hand and he gently brings it back outdoors, free from the horrible existence that I was subjecting it to.
Nice job,
and for him, for me, exactly, right? So for me, it was, I was imposing a kind of Western view, and my right to be in that space was conflicting with its right to be in that space. And he extricated it and saved it, so to speak, from the violence that I was committing onto it. So for him, he looked at it and said, no, this is a being that has moral worth and you shouldn't be harming it.
Yeah, no, that's a good story, and I get the different perspective thing. I have to imagine this person also probably walks around. He probably occasionally steps on bugs inadvertently. He makes a decision that his life is valuable enough such that it warrants killing other beings sometimes, even if it's accidental. He knows if he goes out in the world, he's going to step on an ant, he's going to whatever. He's going to step on grass, he's going to kill a flower, whatever. So I hear the point that there's living things to which we should pay more respect. But at the same time, the only way to not harm other things at all, let alone kill, is to just stop living. That's the only option.
I think his general approach is to live with that. I don't think he would disagree that's a possibility. But he lives with clearly a different degree of sensibility about his impact than perhaps arguably I do or did. Sure. So I think he's certainly trying to, when there are human-animal conflicts, come out on the side of what he believes is the most ethical solution.
Yeah, it's interesting. One question is the picture that I just articulated one in which we are necessarily condemned to evil acts as long as we live? Is our moral theory, or is our moral view so strict that it's not original sin, but it's continuous ongoing sin as we step on bugs and kill and create a house and do this or that? That part of the human condition is to be continuously engaged in deeply morally disrespectful acts towards other living things? Or do you say, look, that makes morality too demanding. It makes it too strict. If we think that morality is like that, that's shitty. But then you might think, but actually, morality is not like that. Morality, some people think, certainly not your biocentrist or your ecocentrist, and not even me, but that in some sense, ethics and morality is for us. It's built for us. It has to be compatible with human flourishing. And if it's not compatible with human flourishing, it's not an ethics worth paying any attention to, something along those lines.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. I'll give you one example that sort of supports that. And a very famous environmental ethicist who passed away not too long ago, Holmes Rolston, said, when you are in nature and you grant it rights, it has rights. And when the moment you leave that space, it's just nature and there are no rights, right? It's only when the human intervenes and says, I planted my flag of rights here, that all of a sudden we have a reason to protect it. So there's definitely that very realistic aspect to be made. I don't know any ethicists, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not as widely read as I could be, who argue that the answer is ultimately a nihilistic one, where you shouldn't do anything and just die to preserve everything else.
Yeah.
I really don't know anyone of any stripe that argues that.
Yeah.
But I think what they would say is, can we do our best? Can we live by a moral code in terms of an ethical program?
Yeah.
And can we try our best to see that we are practicing what we preach? And I think that at the end of the day, like if you are trying, think about the gentleman again from the example with the spider.
Yeah.
He could have just been like this weird Western guy that's just making loud noises.
Sure.
He called me to intervene and then saved the animal.
Yeah.
So he, in his mind, I think he is doing a duty. He's fulfilling a duty to protect animal species, no matter what their degree of sentience is or anything like that. But that's because of his particular Buddhist stance. And maybe you could not get at that through a particular Buddhist stance. You could find out it as an ecocentric or whatever kind of person.
Yeah.
But I think it's just, I don't mean to speak for everyone, but I think that they would generally say, are you trying to live up to your values?
Yeah.
And we're all recognizing, and I like this phrase, it's from an article on what happens, because I wrote this piece on why we shouldn't kill owls. So there was a series of articles that were about this conflict between two different owl species in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And this author who had written on this before and said, we really shouldn't do this, has then came around and said, actually, we should kill one species of owl if it means saving the other one. And I wrote a response piece where I argued under either animal rights or the rights of nature, it's both morally wrong. But at the end of the day, if you realize that we're going to lose one whole species of owl because of what ultimately was a human-caused harm, where there was human encroachment on natural territory. There's this paper that I really like. It's a little bit nihilistic maybe, but it argues that we should revel in the moral residue of the consequences of our actions and be like, we really screwed up and we need to do better next time. Instead of what you said, the sort of extreme version, which is, I guess we can't live, I guess we can't move. They would say, no, we need to be angry at ourselves and strive to do better because our actions resulted in this case, the eradication of entire animal species.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, it's my Nietzschean instincts or whatever are bristling at the idea that we should just be angry with ourselves for a living. But yes, of course, we can go too far. Okay, Josh, so last question. I want to just pivot a little bit because I know that all of this is connected to your view that AI ethics or AI ethicists or something like that, they're not living up to their principles, something along those lines. So is that right?
Yeah, I've written this specifically not about environmental ethicists, but about people in the AI ethics camp.
Yeah.
And they tend to have these very lofty, very socially progressive ideals. But then when push comes to shove and you bring other ideas, whether they're non-Western or indigenous, all of a sudden they recoil in horror, even feminist ideas that pose a challenge to some of their Western individualist kind of assumptions.
What do you have in mind
And
here?
I'll give you, we've been talking about, in this case, the moral status of a non-human technological entity, right?
Yeah.
So in my book, Rights for Robots, when I talk about other cultures as an example of how we don't have a monopoly on ethics in the world, if you look at like Shintoism, for instance, and the role that robots play in a country like Japan, which has Shintoist elements to it, there are people who believe that by possessing a non-human, otherwise inert, perhaps, artifact like a robot, all of a sudden it is imbued with spirits or what they call kami, and that now it's part of your household, it's a member of your family, and it takes on a new kind of moral tinge to it. And if you make that argument to people who say that even having the discussion we're having is dangerous, is wrongheaded, is a waste of time, I always pivot to them and say, are you saying that like these non-Western and indigenous groups can't have a perspective on non-humans, including technology? They never have an answer for this because it shows a weakness in their argument. They want to say diversity is important. They want to say other ways of knowing are important. We should respect especially disenfranchised groups and marginalized groups.
Sure.
But then when you actually bring those ideas of those disenfranchised, marginalized groups to their attention, they bristle at them and they think that, the long and short of it is they don't actually pay any homage to it at all or any kind of respect to it. They just argue that what you're saying is bad and wrong and a waste of time.
Okay, so I can't comment on the sort of empirical claim about how people react to it. That seems plausible.
There's a whole article in this publication called First Monday that's just a hit piece on my book, essentially. And this is really telling. When the main author of this piece presented this at We Robot years ago, I showed up. It was my will to do so. I paid for the conference fee and all that stuff. And I showed up for that session and I asked the author one question. I said, what is the ethical perspective that you are taking that leads you to this conclusion that talking about robot rights is bad. And her response was, I don't have one.
Okay, so much, yeah. So maybe this person's not so bright. But let me just say one thing here, which is something like, yes, there's different moral viewpoints, right? I'm not going to take all of them into consideration equally, or something along those lines. I'm not going to take all of them equally seriously. If someone comes from, say, a Middle Eastern country that thinks women are lesser than men, I'm not going to think, oh, I should really respect their opinion and make sure that my AI or whatever it is subjects the will of women to the will of men out of respect for them. Nobody thinks that. Or, sorry, no one who celebrates diversity, is this right? I don't know, thinks that or should think that or something along those lines. So, yeah, there's lots of different moral beliefs out there, a huge variety from what I find to be moral beliefs that are morally repugnant, like women's will should be subjected to the wills of men, or take any manner of hardcore racist beliefs, etc. So I think and then there are other views that I don't find morally repugnant. I just find them unpersuasive, or that they assume they have certain sort of metaphysical assumptions that I reject. So that's where I'd fall with Shintoism. I'd say, oh yeah, they're presupposing a metaphysics about spirits that I don't sign up for. And so it's not out of disrespect or something along those lines. It's just that their moral beliefs or their ethical beliefs presuppose a metaphysical conception of the world that is spiritual, and I don't accept that metaphysical view of the world. And so I'm not going to live my life in accordance with it. I'm not going to develop AI in accordance with it. I might develop AI in accordance with my value of respecting other people's views, which doesn't mean believing them and following them, but giving them the space to pursue their moral beliefs on the condition that it doesn't interfere with other people's flourishing, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, what's wrong with that? I don't think that I'm being... And if they said the same to me, they said, listen, Reed, your conception of the world is metaphysically anemic. It doesn't include enough. You're discounting the existence of spirits and how they inhabit all these things and fill our world with meaning and value and blah, blah, blah. And so we're not going to create this sort of Western meaning-drained universe in our conception of how we developed AI. And I said, yeah, fair enough. That's fair. You don't have to. I don't feel disrespected. You do your thing. This is a place where it feels like we can just let a thousand flowers bloom. Anyway, does that speak to...
Yeah, so let me just say this. What you just did was a more serious, critical engagement with the substance of my argument, the actual ethical implications of my argument, than anything that those critics have actually done.
Yeah.
So that's the problem, is like they're not even willing
baby.
to have... Look, like I said, you could just put a stamp on that and say that you've now put your flag in the sand and you've established a position and you've articulated why you don't think a particular ethical view is necessarily the right one. They haven't done it. They've essentially run an end around because exactly what I'm asking them to do would run counter to their sort of fundamental ideas and ethics that they approach AI with. So what you just did is actually what I was hoping for. Not necessarily from you, because I know you're capable of it, but the people who say we can't even, any words on a page that are spent even discussing this are wrong and dangerous. There are people exist. They've written that. That's just their thing.
Yeah, so it's a religion. The problem is,
it's
a religion where there's...
It is. It's a unacknowledged ideological commitment that they don't actually make good on.
Yeah, and you get excommunicated if you say the word or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
You have sinful thoughts. Yeah, I'm not going to sign up for that. Josh, this has been great. Super fun. Really interesting stuff. Thanks for... And I really enjoyed the sort of back and forth and tearing apart these biocentric and ecocentric people who... I don't know, haven't read their stuff, so I don't know, but... I don't know if your depiction of them is accurate. I'm not impressed.
Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate the opportunity to defend myself even against a good spar like you.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wasilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.